In this session, we're coming to the last of our series of 13 studies of the Sermon on the Mount. We have progressed from the beginning of the 5th chapter, which talked about the Beatitudes, and have come all the way around through the 6th chapter. And now we're going to talk about the final segment, which is the last half of chapter 7, which we've entitled Building Life on a Firm Foundation, because of the parable that Jesus tells to close out his sermon. We're going to divide this up into some portions, and the first part has to do with verses 13 through 19. Jesus says, "Enter in by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and many there are that enter thereby. But narrow is the gate, and straitened or tight is the way that leads unto life, and few there are that find it. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravening wolves. By their fruits you shall know them. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? Even so every good tree brings forth good fruit. But a corrupt tree brings forth bad fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth bad fruit, neither can a bad tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that does not bring forth good fruit is cut down and cast into the fire." The question we want to look at in this portion is the matter of recognizing false prophets. Jesus comes as a prophet of God, and he is saying some things here about false prophets. And it's of importance to people in every age of God's activities to recognize those who are legitimate representatives of him and those who may not be. And so in recognizing false prophets, what do we look for? Or recognizing true prophets, what do we look for? And the first thing we're going to suggest is, well, we can ask the question, do they glorify God or do they benefit themselves? This may be suggested by the way Jesus begins his statement about the false prophets that come to us in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravening wolves. It is as if they're wolves in wool, trying to deceive those to whom they approach so that they might devour them. We get a little bit suspicious, I think, when the activities of those who claim to be prophets of God really benefit themselves overly much in perhaps a selfish sort of way, especially if a lot of money may be involved in their activities. There are also some other things there, and that is perhaps their ministry is more of a matter of drawing attention to themselves than it is a drawing attention to the God that they supposedly represent. Sometimes people who are what we call limelighters, people who have to be right out there in front of everybody all the time, have a tendency to latch on to religion because it has an opportunity for leadership to be expressed and for attention to be received. And so they enter into this activity in order that they may receive the attention and perhaps the money of those that they would speak to. The question that comes to me, and when we're looking at this, is why is Jesus talking about false prophets anyway? Are there some people of his own day that he is concerned about his followers not following? Or what does he have in mind? And so I think perhaps we would be able to tell from some of the things that he has said earlier in the sermon that he is in fact talking about some people of his own day that were in his estimation false prophets. And so this matter of glorifying themselves rather than God needs to be brought up. The next point that we'd like to make is, do their motives match their appearance? And perhaps this calls our mind back to the section of material that we studied earlier in chapter 6, the first 18 verses, where Jesus worked pretty hard in exposing the hypocrisy of certain religious practices that were going on in his own day. And it is perhaps this matter of hypocrisy that he has also in mind when he talks about the wolves in wool, because they have a first appearance at least of being something that in fact they aren't, or something that inwardly they aren't. So we have to ask the question, in every period of God's activity among men, are those that claim to be sent by him practicing in such a way that their motives evidently match the appearance that they give to all of us in their activities? The third thing that we might draw upon is a kind of a point based under the general material that we are looking at here. Do their actions match their claims? In a way, we can talk about doing the Father's will as really the test of a true prophet. Not the person who says, Lord, Lord, as if to say, I'm identifying myself with you, or I'm identifying myself with the Lord. The question is not so much what people say or what they claim of themselves, but whether this activity on their part matches their claims. I'm reminded of a verse that is used in the Epistle to the Hebrews, chapter 13, verse 7, where the writer encourages his readers to consider those who have the rule over them, and considering the issue, he says, of their life, imitate their faith. The thing that I think is important here is we need to watch people sometime for a little while. First impressions may be good, but if there is hypocrisy involved, it will start coming out in little ways that become more and more obvious over time. And perhaps this is what should be seen in the part about the fruit illustration that he gives. You don't get grapes of thorns or figs off of thistles. And the fruit bearing is something that sometimes takes a while. If we can play on the figure a little bit, it takes a season of a year before a peach develops on a tree. And so if we just keep watching a person for a good while, we'll come to understand whether or not the claims that he is making are legitimate claims by measuring them against his activities. Let's come to the next test that we could talk about, and that is, do their teachings match previous revelation? And I think that was one of the things that Jesus has been concerned about in the Sermon on the Mount. I believe that is the point of his corrective teaching, beginning with chapter 5, verse 20, and going on through the end of that chapter and into chapter 6 with the hypocrisy material. There is a principle that God laid down through Moses a long time ago in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 13. It's very important for people to remember, because by the nature of what it says, it has application to all kinds of situations in which God might be speaking to us, but we have to decide who's the false prophet and who is the true one. The general idea is that whatever a true prophet of God says now must match with what God has said through true prophets before. In other words, God doesn't contradict himself as he goes along the way. Moses puts it this way: if there arise in the midst of you a prophet or a dreamer of dreams, and he gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or the wonder come to pass, whereof he's spoken to you, saying, let's go after other gods which you have not known, and let's serve them, you shall not hearken to the words of that prophet, or to that dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. You shall walk after Yahweh your God, and fear him, and keep his commandments, and obey his voice, and you shall serve him and cleave to him. And that prophet and dreamer of dreams shall be put to death, because he has spoken rebellion against Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and redeemed you out of the house of bondage, to draw you aside out of the way which Yahweh your God commanded you to walk in. So shall you put away evil from the midst of you. And so, if there is a person that arose in the nation of Israel teaching certain kinds of things, and if those things did not match up with what had already been taught by Moses, who was what we call the normative prophet of God, then that prophet or that dreamer of dreams was to be set aside. In fact, he was to be put to death, because he was leading obvious rebellion against Yahweh and his people. It was very clear that God was operating through Moses because of his triumph over the Egyptian magicians, because of the stupendous acts of miraculous display that God gave in connection with his ministry of bringing the people out of Egypt and leading them toward the promised land. Obviously, then, God was with Moses. Therefore, all of those that come along after Moses must say things that are in harmony with what God taught through Moses. And so that principle, I think, applies in all circumstances, even in our own day. A prophet that comes along and says things that are contrary to previous revelation is a prophet who is not a true one. Coming to our fifth idea, when we're testing out prophets, we can ask, do their mighty works require divine assistance? Now, there are all kinds of things that happen in the world. Some of it is magic. Some of it happens. It's really natural occurrences, but we don't know the explanation of how it happens. And sometimes people knowingly or perhaps even unknowingly can latch on to these kinds of things and use them as the basis for getting a hearing, not only from people in general, but even from the people of God. And so one of the other tests that was laid down originally when God spoke through Moses to the Israelite people is found in chapter 18 of the book of Exodus, verses 20 through 22. The prophet that shall speak a word presumptuously in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or that shall speak in the name of other gods, that same prophet shall die. Now, that similar kind of a consequence was expressed back in Deuteronomy chapter 13 we read a while ago. The question, however, comes up, and if you say in your heart, how are we going to know the word which Yahweh has not spoken? When a prophet speaks in the name of Yahweh, if the thing does not follow nor come to pass, that is the thing which Yahweh has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. You shall not be afraid of him. I'd like to put emphasis on the last word of the verse. That prophet has spoken presumptuously. You shall not be afraid of him. Now, the reason I'm putting emphasis on that is not just simply the idea, you shall not be afraid of this particular prophecy that he has given. You are not to be afraid of him. The implication then is that whenever a person is truly serving God as his prophet, and he speaks in God's name about this future event or makes some prediction, it will always come to pass. Now, people from time to time say things and they come to pass, and I'm not sure how all the time they know that, or whether they're just guessing, or whether there's some things that we do not yet understand about the capacities of some people, or whether there's perhaps some demonic connections in certain cases. But the prophet of God always succeeds. And so the mighty works that a person might appeal to as an indication of his being a servant of the Lord need to be those sort of things that need supernatural assistance or divine assistance. Otherwise, they could be assisted by the capacities of the person himself, perhaps by demonic sources. Maybe there are kinds of things that really don't have to have any supernatural and therefore divine explanation at all. And if we look at those as a basis for believing that God is behind such a person, then we're going to be deceived, because in fact he's not, even though that person may be doing some things that we don't understand. The last issue that I'd like to bring up in connection with measuring the false prophet is this: do they teach us what will work? Now, God has created us. He's created the world in which we live. He teaches us how to live in this environment in a way that will work under all circumstances. Now, sometimes people are inclined to speak and put God's divine sanction upon it by their claims. But what they say are things that are only what we might want to hear. It just sort of soothes our conscience and says, you don't have to change, or you don't have to improve, or anything along that line. And when we don't improve and when we don't live according to the will of God, sometimes on the long haul, life does not end up as it ought to end up. And so, as there were false prophets perhaps in the Old Testament era, those who claim to be prophets of God in Jesus' day, there may be prophets of God in our own day. And what Jesus has to say of them here in these verses may be of assistance to us in selecting between those that we would follow and those that we would set aside as the true spokesman of God. The next thing that I want to draw our attention to is found in verses 21 through 23. Now he says this, "Not everyone that says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy by your name, or by your name cast out demons, or by your name do mighty works? And then I will profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you that work iniquity." Now, for a long time, I have pondered in my mind one of the aspects of this set of verses. How, on the one hand, can they be doing the mighty works, prophesying in God's name, casting out demons, doing mighty works, and at the same time be addressed by Jesus later, I never knew you, depart from me, you who work iniquity? It seems to me to be an interesting combination of factors that we might want to look at for a minute or two in connection with this portion of the Sermon on the Mount. How do you put these two things together? Now, there are various suggestions that have come out in the literature here, or that might occur to us. One is that they were these were deceptive signs that the people were doing during their lifetime, and that they were simply lying at the judgment. Now, we put a question mark after that. I think probably things get pretty serious when it comes to that point, and it doesn't sound terribly likely to me. There is another suggestion, is that they were doing divine miracles, but they were not saved. Now, this is a curious suggestion you'll find from time to time in certain literature. I doubt that this is really true, but sometimes it is suggested that a person might have the power of the Spirit and yet not be saved. Now, I cannot quite understand how that might be if, as a matter of fact, the giving of the Spirit is the hallmark of the Christian experience. How a person could have the Spirit and not yet be saved. Sometimes Acts chapter 8 is appealed to in the case of Simon Magus. And the way that this is read is taken to mean that he was able to do miraculous things, and yet when it gets down toward the end of the interchange between him and Peter, it says, "Repent of this wickedness of yours, and pray the Lord, if perhaps the thought of your heart will be forgiven you, because I see that you are in the gall of bitterness and the bond of iniquity." Well, there are several things about the episode that are a little unclear. For one thing, it doesn't specifically say that Simon Magus himself was among those to whom Peter and John had passed out miraculous gifts. That's a moot question. You really can't look at that. Another thing about it is that it doesn't really say that he was never saved. Perhaps by this time Peter is calling into question his salvation, but that doesn't mean that he was never saved. And so I think there is enough unclearness about this episode that we probably would not want to use it as a background for saying a person might be able, empowered by the Holy Spirit, to do miraculous gifts when, as a matter of fact, he wasn't in a saved condition. The next suggestion is that they were doing divine miracles by virtue of their office, but personally were not saved. Now, there's an example or two that's sometimes brought up that might justify this kind of idea. One of them is found in John's Gospel, chapter 11, in the episode recorded in verses 47 through 53, in connection with the high priest at that time, who prophesied that it was necessary that one man should give his life for the people, and that the whole nation should not be destroyed. Now, I am not so sure that this is a clear example of God's prophesying supernaturally through an office held by a person who himself is reprobate or unsaved or in a lost condition. We may simply suppose that Caiaphas said more than he knew in this thing. It's not really clear that it's a supernatural prediction. Another episode that's sometimes brought up is the series of events associated with Balaam in Numbers chapters 22 through 24. It seems to me that there are some unclear elements also in that particular episode, so I'm not so sure I would like to appeal to it. There's some mention in there, for one thing, of Balaam's repentance, and perhaps that's the reason he can go on and do these prophesyings rather than what the enemies of Israel were trying to get him to prophesy. The reason I am particularly doubtful about this suggestion that the people were doing these things by virtue of the office that was divine, all right, rather than through their own saved condition, is that it destroys what we could call the theory of miracles. Supernatural and supernaturally caused results, of course, have to come from God. And this is one of the ways in which God authenticates to the hearers of a prophet that, in fact, a prophet is speaking from himself, from God's revelation. In chapter 1 of Romans, in the 4th verse, it says that Jesus Christ was declared powerfully to be the Son of God by the resurrection from the dead. There is a confirmation of the claim that Jesus made during his ministry that occurs as the result of his being resurrected by the Father from the dead. A less outstanding idea along that same line is found in the 2nd chapter of Mark, and this is in connection with the healing of the paralytic that was let down through the top of the house, as you may recall. He ends up the episode by saying, "Which is easier, to say to the sick of the palsy, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Rise up and take your bed and walk'? That you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he says to the sick of the palsy, "I say to you, get up, take up your bed, and go to your house." And he arose and straightway took up his bed, went out before all of them, insomuch that they were amazed and glorified God, saying, "We never saw it this way before." Now, it seems to me that these two passages, along with others that you might appeal to of this same nature, indicate that miraculous manifestation is one of the ways that God indicates who his true prophets are, to keep them distinguished from those who might be false prophets, or simply to make clear to people that something is being said to them by God above. Now, if we have unsaved people doing miraculous things, regardless of whether they occupy a divinely appointed office or not, I think that cuts against the whole theory of what miraculous manifestation is intended to accomplish. The fourth suggestion that we might come up with in measuring how these can be mighty works and yet Jesus never knew them. They had done divine miracles, but afterwards apostatized. Now, of course, whether this is a legitimate suggestion or not depends upon a person's whole understanding of the possibility of whether a man is ever allowed by God to get away from a saved condition once he has accepted it. And we don't have the time to get into that particular issue, but I think we could leave that as an option, although I'm not terribly enamored with it because it's a rather restricted possibility. And so we'll pass on to the fifth suggestion, is that they thought they were doing divine miracles, but their mighty works were really demonic miracles. And this is a curious suggestion. I suppose that it has some merit to it, and I'm not too sure how much merit to give to it. It's possible, perhaps, but we may not want to hang too much weight upon it. In other words, the confusion here is that there are two sources of supernatural power, the divine and the demonic as well. Now, there are ways to distinguish those from each other, but it would be awfully easy simply because the events at hand are supernatural to get that all confused, even if you were the one that was doing them. And so we pass on to another suggestion. They thought they were doing divine miracles, but their mighty works were really what we call paranormal phenomena. That is, things that really have a natural explanation. But we don't know what that natural explanation is. It's not exactly the normal sort of thing you see, and so it's paranormal, but it has a natural explanation. So there is divine, there is demonic, there is trickery, and there is perhaps paranormal. And after we come to understand the mechanisms that cause it to occur, then we would call it normal, I suppose. That is a much better suggestion, it seems to me. And then lastly, we might just say that Jesus was speaking in a general way that might include more than one of the previous options above, and particularly the one about apostasy, or the one we just mentioned about paranormal phenomena. Jesus is speaking, I think, in a general way. It doesn't have to tie down to any specific matter. It's just that these mighty signs that they were doing, they thought was a basis upon which they could feel to be legitimate prophets, and therefore approach Jesus with this on the judgment day. The third thing we want to do with our portion is to look at the parable that Jesus uses to close out the Sermon on the Mount. Verses 24 through 27, everyone that hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock, and the rains descended, the floods came, and the winds blew, and beat upon that house, and it did not fall, because it was based on a rock. Everyone that hears these words of mine and does not do them is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand, and the rains descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and smote that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. It seems to me that we could sum up much of what is done in the Sermon on the Mount by looking at this parable and then retrospecting back into the things that are in the previous two chapters by talking about what is a wise man. And we have three main characteristics we want to point out about him. First of all, that a wise man lives life by values. You notice Jesus says here, everyone that hears these words of mine, or these teachings of mine. Now, if that is the case, a person who is living by values will not be living by popular opinion, because that's just kind of going along with the environment, and he talks about the broad and narrow road. He will not be living simply by his drives, and Jesus talks against the idea of living by lust and anger. He'll not just do what the environment stimulates him to do. He lives consciously and intentionally. Even one of the pagan philosophers said the unreasoned life is not worth living. If we don't live by principles, then we're going to be tossed to and fro by all kinds of things within us and around us. The next element of the wise man's approach to life is that the wise man puts out the necessary effort. And of course, this is pictured in the person who puts out the extra effort of digging down to the bedrock and laying his foundations upon that. Perhaps this recalls to our mind the hypocrisy of the people who are talked about in the first part of chapter 6. And so sometimes the easiest way to go on something is just to go out and start building a house. Well, that may be fine for a while, but it won't last. We are not, in other words, to follow the path of least resistance. And so we're not to just love our friends, but love also our enemies. We're supposed to take that positive effort at reconciliation to the person that may be around us that we do not have too good of associations with when we come to offer our sacrifice. The third principle is that a wise man lives life on the long haul. And this again is exemplified by the fact that the person took the extra effort and took the extra time to adopt a way of building a house that would last through the hard times. Any old religion will do when everything is going fine. But you need to have that kind of power for life that will take you through the times of famine as well as the times when there is plenty to eat, so to speak. And so Jesus has talked a good bit about power to deal with life, and we talked about psychological strength in the last part of chapter 6, and that goes on down into chapter 7, I think, when a person has a power of personality that he can cope with the things of life, and he can cope with them if he is living life according to the principles that God has laid down for him. Living life on the long haul, I think, says to us, in summary, that the blessings, blessed be this kind of person and that God gives to us are something like time capsules. And as time goes on, if we're living the life that he wants us to live, certain of those blessings start taking effect. And you cannot have the blessings that are 40 years down the line if you don't live life back here in such a way as to make an appropriate preparation for the coming about of those blessings later. You know, the way we raise our children becomes an example of this kind of a thing. And when we get on down the line, our joy and happiness in our golden years as grandparents is pretty much dependent upon the way we perhaps have lived in the raising of our children. The blessings of life are based then upon living by values, putting out the extra effort, and living life on the long haul.